Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.
Well, welcome to another episode of Traveling Through History. Today we have a special episode for you to talk about one of the most important documents in world history, and one of the most important documents that impacted humans and human rights and people's rights is called Magna Carta. And we will get into all the history and the impact of Magna Carta, what it came out of, the precursor of it, which was the Charter of Liberties, which was a document that came about 100 years earlier, and then all of the documents that have been impacted from it since, which of course is all the different constitutions of Western countries, all the way up to the Declaration of Independence and the U.S. Constitution in the United States, all of them being impacted by the spirit of Magna Carta. So what was Magna Carta? It was really a document that was responding to barons and other ruling class and landowner class complaints in England to King John, who was the king at the time. And he was really a horrible king in so many different ways. He ruled with an iron fist. He taxed his people way, way too much, and they really were starting to rebel and push back against him and form militias and do all kinds of things to really try to get some of their rights and some of their own power back as barons and landowners. And so this was a response by John, who knew that his time was up if he did not sign something like an agreement or some kind of pact. So Magna Carta came out of that, but it really started way before that. It started during the days of William the Conqueror in 1066, when he took over England and put in a feudal system. And that feudal system then led, of course, to taxes being levied on the British people for hundreds of years, of which they started to rebel at this time that we're talking now, which was 1215 AD. The Plantagenet dynasty, we'll talk some about that. We'll talk some of the kings before John who were implementing this feudal system, and how the Magna Carta really came down as the first attempt to really put down on paper the rights of the people and to try to protect them in so many different ways. And we'll get into all those different clauses in Magna Carta that actually impacted people's rights, and that laid the foundation for those of us who are living under freedom today and the documents that we have as part of our government. So let's go ahead and get into Magna Carta and the lead up to it and what it actually is. So this is Magna Carta, History and Legacy from 1215 AD. You see a great picture there on the top left of King John, and he was signing the document itself, putting his stamp on it. There's no actual proof that he actually did sign it himself. This is just a picture that's depicting that. Many people believe that he actually didn't even read the document. He let his right-hand men look at it and agree to it and put his stamp on it. But either way, that's a good depiction there of him agreeing to the principles in the document itself. The picture below that is his King's Council, which was a whole new concept, never been tried before in English history or really even royal history, which was to have a council similar to like a legislature or a deliberative body below him that would help counsel him and give him advice on whether he should or shouldn't levy a tax, or whether he should or shouldn't pass a law, those kinds of things. This was the first attempt at having some people's representatives advise a king and try to put some restraints on him and what he could do. Another picture there on the bottom left of the kings and his representatives looking at the Magna Carta document. Then there's actually a picture of the Magna Carta there on the bottom right. That's one of the many pages of it. It was actually 3,000 words in total. And then another picture just above that, which was the barons and the people who were actually announcing the signing of the Magna Carta and the important impact that had on English law, English history, and then, of course, the rest of the West since then. So let's talk first about King Henry I. This was some time before the Magna Carta, and it happened in 1100. King Henry I, a picture there of him signing the Charter of Liberties, which was the first document that had been tried along these lines and became a framework for Magna Carta. And this Charter of Liberties was issued by King Henry I in 1100 and served as a precursor by outlining limitations on royal power and promising to uphold certain rights and liberties While not as comprehensive as Magna Carta, it addressed abuses of royal authority and foreshadowed some of the principles later enshrined in the larger document, Magna Carta. Issued by King Henry I upon his accession, this charter addressed issues like excessive taxation, the abuse of vacant church positions, and other perceived wrongdoings by his predecessor, William II. It aimed to bind the king to certain laws regarding the treatment of nobles, church officials, and individuals. So this is really the first document ever that tried to bring some liberties to the people and also tried to hold the king accountable, that he was not above the law and that he had to abide by English law as it was. It aimed to bind the king to certain laws. It is considered a landmark document and a precursor to the Magna Carta. Historians like Frederick Maitland and Frederick Pollock recognize it as an important step in the development of English legal history and legal frameworks. Let's talk about the Plantagenet dynasty, which ruled from 1154 to 1485. This House of Plantagenet was a royal house of England which reigned during that time and provided 14 kings, 6 of whom belonged to the cadet houses of Lancaster and York. The royal line descended from the union between Geoffrey, who was the Count of Anjou, who died in 1151, and the Empress Matilda, daughter of English King Henry I, and that's the king we were just talking about earlier. Although well established, the surname Plantagenet has little historical justification. It seems to have originated as a nickname to Count Geoffrey and has been variously explained as referring to his practice of wearing a sprig of broom, Latin for genista, in his hat, or more probably to his habit of planting brooms to improve his hunting covers. It was not, however, a hereditary surname, and Geoffrey's descendants in England remained without one for more than 250 years. So you have to understand at this time surnames were not common, and we didn't really have surnames until much later. Surnames became universal outside the royal family at that time, but the royals did not pick them up until 250 years later. Some historians apply the name House of Anjou or Angevine dynasty to Henry II, who was also Count of Anjou, and his 13 successors. Other historians label only Henry II and his son Richard I and John as Angevine kings, for want of a better name. And they labeled their successors, notably Edward I, Edward II, and Edward III, as Plantagenets. The first official use of the surname Plantagenet by any descendant of Count Geoffrey occurred in 1460, so many years later. So many people think Plantagenet dynasty really was looking backwards and wasn't really used at the time, but is now used to describe it. It's a really interesting history there about the Plantagenet dynasty, which really was a merger of the Anjous and the Plantagenets. So let's talk about Henry II's legacy. Henry II was King of England from 1154 until his death in 1189. So you can see he ruled for a full 35 years, which was a very long reign back then. During his reign, he controlled England and substantial parts of Wales, Ireland, and much of France, including Normandy, Anjou, and Aquitaine, an area that altogether was later called the Angevine Empire, and also held power over Scotland and the Duchy of Brittany. Henry was the eldest son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, or Count of Anjou, and Matilda, daughter of Henry I of England. By the age of 14, Henry became politically and militarily involved in his mother's efforts to claim the English throne, at that time held by their cousin Stephen of Blois. Henry's father made him Duke of Normandy in 1150, and upon his father's death in 1151, Henry inherited Anjou, Maine, and Touraine. His marriage to Eleanor of Aquitaine brought him control of the Duchy of Aquitaine. Henry and Eleanor had 8 children. 3 of their sons would rule as king. As his sons grew up, Henry struggled to find many ways to satisfy their desires for land and immediate power. So you can imagine he had so many children, as you see there in the family tree, and many of them males. So he really found a hard way to try to split up this empire so that all of his sons felt like they had a purpose and a role. Henry's empire quickly collapsed during the reign of his son John, who succeeded Richard I in 1199. But many of the changes Henry introduced during this lengthy rule had long-term consequences on English history. Henry II's legal changes are generally considered to have laid the basis for English common law. So he really was a very impactful king, as you can see, and several of his sons actually ruled as king as well. And we'll talk about each of those. So the first one we'll get into is Richard I, who was called the Lionheart. See a picture there on the right of him. And one interesting thing about Henry and several of his children, Henry II's children, was they spent much of their time outside of England. Even though they were dukes or kings of England, they spent much of their time in France and other locations. Richard was the third son of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. He was given the Duchy of Aquitaine, his mother's inheritance, at age 11, and was enthroned as Duke in Poitiers in 1172. Richard possessed precocious political and military abilities, and he won fame for his knightly prowess, so he was really good on the battlefield. He quickly learned how to control the turbulent aristocracy of Poitou and Gascony. He joined his brothers in the Great Rebellion in 1173 and 74 against their own father, who invaded Aquitaine twice before Richard submitted and received a pardon. So interestingly enough, he and several of his brothers fought against their father, but were forgiven later and given a pardon. Richard received Normandy on July 20th and the English throne on September 30th. Richard, unlike Philip, had only one ambition: to lead the crusade prompted by Saladin's capture of Jerusalem in 1187. This was a complete obsession for Richard at the time, and he wanted to get Jerusalem back for Christianity. He had no concept of planning for the future of the English monarchy and put everything up for sale to buy arms for the crusade. Yet he had not become king to preside over the dismemberment of the Angevin Empire. He broke with Philip and did not neglect Angevin defenses on the continent. Open war was averted only because Philip also took the Crusaders' cross. Richard dipped deep into his father's treasure and sold sheriffdoms and other offices. With all of this, he raised a formidable fleet and an army, and in 1190, he departed for the Holy Land, traveling via Sicily. He returned only once back to England and was crowned for the second time on April 17th, fearing that the independence of the kingdom had been compromised. So as we said before, many of these brothers, especially Richard, spent very little time in England, and really during his entire rule was only in England for about 6 total months. But he did return after this one trip to the Holy Land because he came back to make sure that his crown was secure in England. He laid siege to his castle of Chaillot and in an unlucky moment was wounded by actually one of his men via arrow. And he actually forgave that man as he was dying. He died in 1199, shortly after that unfortunate accident, and was buried in Abbey Church, where Henry II and Queen Eleanor are also buried. So he was buried with his parents. It's really fascinating history behind the Lionheart and how he was killed by one of his own men in a freak accident, but was one of the great military leaders of Henry II's children. So let's talk about his younger brother who inherited the kingdom from Richard when he was killed, and that's King John, and he was called Lackland. And the reason he was called Lackland is because he was the only one of the 8 children who did not receive lands from his father. So he was one of the few noblemen out of that group that actually didn't have lands that he could call his own. From killing his nephew to losing his empire to cruelly starving his enemies to death, King John was much more than the fictitious villain of the Robin Hood legend, which he was. John was born around Christmas 1166 or maybe even 1167. They're not sure the exact year. The uncertainty exists because he was the youngest of the 8 children of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, and consequently not regarded as all important since no one expected him to be king and he had no lands. His father was the most powerful ruler in Europe, King of England, Duke of Normandy, and Count of Anjou, and Duke of Aquitaine thanks to his marriage to Eleanor. Henry's intention was that his vast empire would be divided after his death, and he designated each of his 3 older sons as heirs to each of the provinces. There initially was no provision for John, which led to his contemporary nickname Lackland. By the time Henry II died in 1189, 2 of his sons had predeceased him, enabling the eldest survivor, Richard, to inherit their father's empire in its entirety, as we mentioned earlier. Richard I almost immediately departed on his crusade to the Holy Land, earning the name Lionheart. John stirred up discontent in England while Richard was gone and conspired with the King of France, Philip Augustus, to attack Richard's lands on the continent. John also issued the Magna Carta to quell rebellion against barons and land-owning class. And of course, that's what we're talking about in the program today, is that he felt forced to do so because he had a rebellion on his hands of all the landowners in England who were tired of the taxation he was bringing upon them and all the regulations and rules. So he really was kind of an insufferable king, very unpopular. Many people wanted him dead. The common man despised him. The barons despised him. And the Magna Carta was his way to try to quell this rebellion and try to get peace in the kingdom again so he could bring everybody back together. So let's talk about negotiation over Magna Carta. So during King John's reign, it was marked by conflict and heavy taxation to fund his military campaigns. Many of those military campaigns, of course, were unsuccessful. He was unlike his other brothers. He was not a good military leader and often made huge mistakes on the battlefield. His abuses of feudal customs and exploitation of barons led to growing discontent. The barons, led by Stephen Langton, Archbishop of Canterbury, presented King John with a set of demands, initially outlined in a document known as Articles of the Barons. The Magna Carta was the result of negotiations between King John and English barons in 1215, forcing the king to acknowledge certain rights and liberties of those barons. These negotiations took place at Runnymede, near the Thames, between June 10th and June 19th of that year. The barons, frustrated with the king's abuses of power, presented him with a document outlining their grievances and demands. While specifics of the negotiation process are not fully detailed that happened there in Runnymede, it involved intense discussions and the eventual agreement to the royal charter by the king. The result of the negotiations was Magna Carta, or Great Charter, a formal document that King John agreed to, though he later sought to annul it and he often would abuse it. Magna Carta introduced 63 clauses addressing the barons' grievances and establishing certain rights and liberties for the people. So as you can see, this negotiation was very important over this tremendous document and really was the only way that open civil war was avoided by King John and the barons, who were very much bringing their militias and starting to create a war. And this became, again, the outline for and the foundation of English law going forward, and really all the Western countries since then have followed many of the same principles. So let's talk about some of the other provisions in the Magna Carta that were really important. One of the first ones was the church rights and freedoms. Magna Carta, particularly its first clause, explicitly protected the English church's freedom and rights, ensuring its liberties remained unimpaired by royal interference. This was really important because up to this point, English kings had done nothing but interfere and try to steer the leadership of the church and the people that they wanted to implant so that they could control it. This meant the church could freely elect its own officials, manage its property, and have its affairs handled in church courts, free from lay control. These provisions were crucial in establishing a degree of autonomy for the church, limiting the king's power over religious institutions. The very first clause of Magna Carta declares that the English church shall be free and shall have its rights undiminished and its liberties unimpaired, according to National Archives. This clause was a significant step in establishing the church's autonomy from royal control. The document guaranteed that church would elect its own officials without royal interference, which was a major point of contention between the church and the crown. Magna Carta also prohibited the king from seizing church lands, safeguarding the church's financial independence and resources. And this very much lays the foundation for the principle we know today under the U.S. Constitution, which is the separation of church and state, which is incredibly important as a principle so that churches and people of faith can exercise their religion free from government interference. So the next principle in the Magna Carta we need to talk about is the right of property. So up to this point, you have to realize that there was a lot of friction between the kings who had preceded John and even he himself, who were trying to take over lands that they wanted and would often not respect the land rights of landowners. Magna Carta, signed in 1215, established several key principles related to property rights, though it primarily focused on the rights of barons and free men. Key provisions included protections against arbitrary seizure or confiscation of property, the right to inherit property, and the right to compensation of property taken by the crown. Magna Carta stipulated that no free man could be deprived of his property except by lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. So essentially put any of these types of land disputes into courts, and the judgment would have been made by a jury of their peers. This protected against the king's arbitrary actions and established the principle of due process. While initially focusing on the rights of barons and free men, Magna Carta's principles regarding property rights had a lasting impact in English law. The document is considered a foundation for modern concepts of property rights, due process, and the rule of law, as you can see. It's a really important provision there, the whole concept of the right of property, an individual having that property, being able to hold it against any government interference. So the next important principle to talk about is jury trial and legal proceedings. Magna Carta, particularly in Chapter 39, laid the groundwork for the right to a jury trial, though it didn't explicitly establish a modern jury system as we have today. It stipulated that no free man could be punished except by the lawful judgment of his peers or by the law of the land, which later evolved into the concept of a trial by jury. This principle, along with other rights enshrined in Magna Carta, significantly influenced the development of American and European jury systems. Over time, the lawful judgment of peers evolved into the modern jury system that we do have today. English common law incorporated the jury system, and it became a cornerstone for justice for all. The Sixth Amendment in the U.S. Constitution guarantees the right to a speedy and public trial by an impartial jury in all criminal cases. The Seventh Amendment protects the right to a jury trial in civil cases involving a certain monetary value. And so you can see a picture there of the Sixth and Seventh Amendment out of the U.S. Constitution, which very much were on the foundational blocks that were laid by this jury trial legal proceedings out of the Magna Carta. So very important clauses there for individual rights and the ability to have a jury review your guilt or non-guilt. So next thing to talk about, and we mentioned this a little bit in the lead up to the program, the Kingdom's Council and how important a concept this was. In Magna Carta, the Common Council of the Kingdom refers to a deliberative body that advises the king, particularly on matters of taxation. It's a precursor to Parliament and represents a crucial step towards limiting the king's absolute power by requiring his consent for levying taxes. This clause is a key element in the development and representative government in England and beyond. While not a fully formed parliament, the Common Council laid the groundwork for the idea that the king's power was not unlimited and that he needed to seek the consent of his subjects, or at least their representatives, for certain actions. The Common Council was composed of leading figures in the kingdom, including archbishops, bishops, abbots, earls, and greater barons. These individuals were summoned by the king by invitation letters. It's a really important concept here. This has not been tried before until Magna Carta, and that was this concept of a deliberative body or representatives of the people, representing those people and representing their interests and putting a check on the king, not giving him unlimited ability to do whatever he wanted. And you can see what one of those letters would have looked by with the seal of the king and the invitation to each of these individuals to come join this Kingdom's Council, to come talk about important matters. So another item to talk about is the limits on feudal service. Clause 12 of Magna Carta stipulated that no scourge or a tax paid by a knight in lieu of military service, or aid, which was specific feudal obligations or general taxes, could be levied in the kingdom without general consent of the realm, which at the time referred to nobles. Clause 16 stated that no one could be forced to perform more service for a knight's fee or any other free holding of land than was actually owed from that holding. This addressed concerns about the fairness and cost of foreign wars, requiring consultation with the barons and major financial levies like scutage and aids, specifying the legitimate reasons for demanding aids, ensuring individuals were not compelled to provide more service than due based on their land holdings, placing restraints on the king's control over wardship and feudal services in certain circumstances. This led to the no taxation without representation clause in the U.S. Constitution. So this was an incredibly important concept, that the king couldn't just tax anything he wanted as much as he wanted, but there were limits on what he could tax somebody based on how much land they had and how much service they had already provided, and that they needed to have representation from people that were in front of the king to make sure their rights were upheld and protected. So another concept in Magna Carta we need to talk about is the fair fines for free men and businesses. Magna Carta included important provisions concerning fair fines for free men and businesses, notably in Clause 20, which was the proportionality of fines. For a minor offense, a freeman could only be fined according to the nature of the offense, and for a serious offense, the fine would be proportional to its magnitude. The important element of that fine should be so heavy as to provide the individual of their livelihood. So that was a really important concept that had never been tried until this time, that you couldn't fine somebody so much that they couldn't afford it, or that it was disproportional with what they'd done. And also you couldn't prevent them from having an ability to create a livelihood, no matter how heavy the fine was. Next part of this provision was protection of livelihood and trade, specifically for merchants. The fine would spare their merchandise. For villains, the fine would save their implements of husbandry if they were subject to the mercy of the royal court. Assessment by peers. Crucially, these fines were not to be imposed arbitrarily by the king or his officials, but rather by the assessment on an oath of reputable men of the neighborhood. So again, this concept of kind of like a jury trial, or people of your peers deciding what the penalty should be. So in essence, and importantly, Clause 20 established the principle that fines should be fair and reasonable, proportional to the offense, not imposed in a way that would ruin a person's ability to make a living. Again, a really important principle, and something that was codified and later supported in all of the documents later in Western culture. Looking at the next item, this is really important, limiting power of the sheriffs. Magna Carta included several clauses aimed at limiting power of sheriffs in England, who often held significant authority within their respective counties. Judicial authority, sheriffs were forbidden from holding lawsuits that should be handled by royal justices, aiming for a more uniform justice system. Seizure of possessions, the document restricted the sheriff's ability to seize possessions without a royal warrant specifying the reason. Requisition of resources, Clause 30 stated the sheriffs could not take horses or carts from freemen against their will for transport duty. Clause 31 further specified sheriffs and other royal officials could not take wood without owner's consent. Abuse of legal process, Magna Carta addressed issues like sheriffs potentially manipulating legal process, delaying cases, and accepting bribes, which had eroded public confidence in the justice system. Appointment of qualified officials, Clause 45 stipulated that only those knowledgeable in the law and committed to upholding it would be appointed as justices, constables, sheriffs, and other officials. So this was a really important provision in Magna Carta that really put limits on what sheriffs and the police forces that worked under them could do. And it forced them to have a warrant. It forced them to not take any property without owner's consent. It forced them to work through the judicial system and make things in terms of justice be a lot more fair for the individual. It's really important concepts here. Before this, kings would just send their sheriffs out and they would do whatever they wanted to. So this really put some real restraints. Next item, we're going to talk about distributing and taxing deceased persons' property. This was a concept that had been ratcheting up from John and some of his predecessors. They were starting to tax and re-tax people, including when somebody was deceased, they would tax their estate. Magna Carta included several provisions related to distribution and taxation of deceased persons' properties, primarily focused on feudal landholding and inheritance rights for the landholding aristocracy. Fixed rates was one of the concepts. One of the core grievances addressed by Magna Carta was King John's practice of imposing exorbitant reliefs of inheritance taxes when an heir took over a feudal estate. It also established old reliefs. Magna Carta established fixed lower rates for these reliefs based on ancient custom of fees. This aimed to limit the king's ability to arbitrarily seize land or financially cripple heirs through excessive taxation. Example rates: the heir of an earl would pay, for instance, £100 for an entire earldom's baronry, while the knight's heir would pay 100 shillings at most for a knight's fee. Distribution by relatives and friends. The charter provided that if a free man died intestate, their chattels would be distributed through the hands of their nearest relatives and friends with the oversight of the church. So you can see it really was giving some more and more oversight and restraints on the king by using the church and the court systems. In terms of debt payments, debts owed by the deceased would be paid, and the remaining chattels would be distributed to the beneficiaries, saving their reasonable portions to the deceased wife and children. So really important here to have rights for the distributions of these deceased assets to individuals, which was not protected earlier, and often the kings would come along and take most of it or all of it. And this really provided some of those protections. Next one is limiting use of court orders. Magna Carta aimed to limit the arbitrary power of the king and establish principles that influence the development of the rule of law and due process. While it didn't exactly restrict court orders in the modern sense, several clauses placed limits on the king's ability to act without legal justification, which included matters that would eventually be addressed by court orders in later legal systems. Magna Carta established the principle that the king was not above the law, meaning he had to adhere to legal processes and could not act based solely on his own will. This included limiting the king's ability to arbitrarily imprison or punish individuals. The charter guaranteed that no free man shall be seized, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or ruined in any way, except by lawful judgment of his peers and a law of the land. This established a right to a fair trial and protected against arbitrary actions by the king and his officials. Magna Carta guaranteed that king would not sell, deny, or delay right or justice. This meant individuals had access to legal system to seek redress for grievances, and the king could not impede this process. So this is really important concepts that we later take for granted today, but really back then didn't exist, and that was due process and the ability to limit court orders by the king. Freedom of merchants. So Magna Carta, specifically Clause 41, offered protections for merchants by ensuring their safe passage and trade within England and free from undue taxation and interference. It guaranteed merchants safe conduct to and from England, as well as freedom of movement and commerce, both by land and by sea, while only requiring the payment of established custom duties. This protection aimed to foster trade and economic activity by removing arbitrary restrictions and ensuring merchants could conduct business without fear of excessive tolls or other forms of harassment. This protection was crucial for the development of trade in England, fostering a more stable and predictable environment for merchants and encouraging economic growth. While the charter generally protected merchants, it allowed for the detention of enemy merchants during wartime until the safety of English merchants in enemy territory was determined. The principles of safe conduct and freedom from arbitrary taxation established in Magna Carta had a lasting effect on development of English law and influenced legal systems, as you can see. So really important that this trade system be put in place under Magna Carta, and that English merchants were able to move freely and do the business that they wanted without excessive taxation. So another one was the women's appeals and arrests. Magna Carta, while a landmark document for liberties, did not grant equal rights to women, particularly regarding appeals and arrests. Clause 54 specifically limited a woman's appeal for murder to only her husband's death, preventing others from being arrested based on her accusation in other cases. This clause highlights the limited legal standing of women at the time, who were often viewed as unreliable or lacking legal identity outside their husbands. And here's the actual quote from the document: "No one shall be arrested or imprisoned upon the appeal of a woman for the death of any other than her husband." So really, this was kind of an outrageous clause if you think about it. Women could only testify in the murder of their husband and no one else, basically had to be a man that did the testimony. It's really kind of an outrageous view of how women were treated differently under law back then. This restriction suggests that a woman's testimony in legal matters was not considered reliable as a man's. Magna Carta, while a step towards limiting the king's power, did not extend to those limitations to women's legal rights, particularly regarding appeals and accusations. So as you can see, this document was a great step forward for the rights of the people, but women definitely did not get included as part of this process. So another clause we want to talk about, forgiving past grievances. This was really important. You see another picture there of King John. Magna Carta addresses the issue of forgiving past grievances as a means of achieving peace and reconciliation between King John and the English barons. Clause 62 of the Magna Carta details the agreement between King John and the barons to forgive and pardon all animosity and offenses that had arisen during their dispute from Easter 1215 until peace was restored. This clause highlights the significance of forgiving those who oppose the government as a means to achieve peace and reconciliation, thereby restoring harmony and stability within the realm. This was an important clause to bring the kingdom back together and united so that it could move forward. And this was an incredibly important clause. It really was at the end of the Magna Carta, and very important to achieve the ends of what King John wanted in his realm, which was to restore peace and end the rebellion and get back to moving forward as a kingdom. So, and that was really kind of the major purpose for Magna Carta in the first place, was to provide some of the rights that people were demanding, but to get back to a peaceful situation. So impact on the rights of people of Magna Carta, the overall impact. While Magna Carta primarily focused on limiting the king's power and protecting the rights of barons, it indirectly impacted the rights of common people by establishing fundamental legal principles that would later be extended to them. These principles included due process, protection from illegal imprisonment, the right of a fair trial, among others. The principles enshrined in Magna Carta, such as rule of law and limitations on royal authority, served as a foundation of the development of constitutional governance in England and later influenced the development of legal systems in the United States and other countries. Although Magna Carta was not initially intended to address the rights of all commoners, it established legal precedents that would eventually lead to recognition and protection of individual rights for all citizens in later documents and iterations. So you can see the impact was huge. Magna Carta, as I said in the lead-in, was one of the most important documents in human history for that reason. It really was a huge shift from the aristocratic and authoritarian view of government to now the sharing of power with the people. So some of the inspiration for U.S. founders and U.S. Constitution found in the Magna Carta. Magna Carta significantly influenced U.S. founding fathers and the U.S. Constitution, primarily by providing a model for limiting government power and protecting individual liberties. It established the principle that even a monarch is subject to the law, a concept that resonated deeply with Americans who sought to create a government accountable to the people. Magna Carta, particularly clauses 39 and 40, established the idea that government's power is not absolute, and that individuals have certain rights that must be respected. This principle directly influenced the American founders' decision to create a system of checks and balances to limit the powers of the federal government. Magna Carta's emphasis on due process and the protection of individual rights, such as freedom of unlawful seizure and the right to a fair trial, served as foundation for the American Bill of Rights. For example, 5th and 14th Amendments ensuring due process. Magna Carta served as a powerful symbol of liberty and justice, inspiring American founders to create a nation that valued individual freedoms and limited government power. And you can see a picture there of the Magna Carta being reviewed and signed, and then another picture there of the Bill of Rights in the U.S. Constitution. So you can see it really was a bedrock for U.S. Constitution and many other Western countries who had very similar documents that enshrined individual freedoms and limited governmental power. Well, let's go ahead and take a look at a series of 2 videos, and then we'll come back and talk about those on the other side. Well, just wanted to take a moment to do a shout out to our sponsor for tonight's Traveling Through History episode, and that is Barnes & Noble. And just one of my favorite places to go. Have one very close to my house. Go to it quite often. I like to go through there and just browse through all the great books and magazines. They have CDs, DVDs, everything you can imagine. They even have a little cafe in there. You can sit and drink your coffee or your hot chocolate. It's just a great time. And so definitely check out your local Barnes & Noble store or go to barnesandnoble.com and go check out a book and purchase something or just have a great afternoon sitting in there and looking at all the great offerings that they have. So again, thank you so much, Barnes & Noble, for sponsoring us tonight. We'll see you next time.
The signing of the Magna Carta was undoubtedly a crucial point in English history, but it has also gained international significance since it was first drafted. You've probably heard of the Magna Carta, or Great Charter, but how much do you know about the document itself and the impact that it had on society? The story of the Magna Carta starts with Henry II's youngest son, John. As John had 3 older brothers, the chances that he would inherit the crown, or many lands, was so slight that he was nicknamed Lackland. Nevertheless, John was Henry's favorite, and Henry planned to bestow his youngest son with extensive lands upon his marriage. This favoritism was a contributing factor in the rebellion of Henry's other sons. Despite friction between the brothers, for some unknown reason, John sided with his brother Richard. By the time that Henry II died in 1189, 2 of John's older brothers had died, and the crown went to the eldest surviving son, Richard. Richard, later called Lionheart, granted John land and a yearly income and promptly left England to embark on a crusade. However, Richard must have been aware of his brother's ambitions, as he made John promise not to enter England while he was away. John agreed, but probably secretly hoped that Richard would die while on the crusade, leaving the English crown to him. When the childless Richard announced that his successor would be his nephew Arthur, the son of his deceased brother Geoffrey, John broke his oath and returned to England in 1190, while Richard was still abroad. After reconciling with Richard, John was named the heir to the throne of England and was crowned after Richard died in 1199. After finally achieving what must have at times felt like an impossible dream, John was King of England. Unfortunately, his reign was a disaster. Under John, England lost most of its authority in France. John also quarreled with the papacy and was briefly excommunicated. In England, increased taxation to fund a military campaign in France stirred up discontent amongst the powerful barons. The English monarchs had dominated the barons since the conquest of William I in 1066. Although every subsequent monarch whose claim to the throne was challenged had made concessions to both the nobles and the clergy, there was no clear definition of the financial liabilities of the barons or the rights that they held over their subjects. As the power and prestige of the Plantagenet dynasty grew, the barons became more aware of the weakness of their position. While things were coming to a head under the rule of John, increased taxes under the reign of Richard also contributed to the ongoing discontent, as the king could finance whatever crusade or war that he wished with money taken from the barons' pockets. John did not get off to a good start with the barons, since he didn't offer any concessions to them, nor did he issue a general charter, despite having a contender to the throne in his nephew Arthur. Things went from bad to worse when John continued his campaigns in France, while promising the barons he would give the barons their rights if they remained loyal to him. Still, it wasn't long before the barons were refusing to cross the channel to support John, until he promised them their rights. All of the tension culminated in the creation of a new charter, an initial draft of which was read in 1215. As most of the documents that were issued before the charter was finalized still exist, it is clear that John was well aware of the precariousness of his position. John knew he would have to meet the majority of the barons' needs and grant the free election to ecclesiastical offices rather than assign the positions himself. The nobles themselves were leaning toward a violent open rebellion, although they were eventually tempered and convinced to negotiate by Archbishop Stephen Langton and the Earl of Pembroke, William Marshall. On June 15, 1215, the text that would lead to the draft of the Great Charter was agreed upon. Called the Articles of the Barons set out their demands. Discussions were held at Runnymede to hammer out the draft of the Magna Carta, the final version of which was agreed on June 19th. The Magna Carta contained clauses that were designed to lead to reforms in local administration and judicial practices. Still, the most critical part of the Magna Carta was that it was the first document to state the principle that the king and his government were not above the law. Its primary purpose was to prevent the monarch from exploiting his power and placing limitations on royal authority. The document put a stop to the divine and absolute rule of the king, and was the first step toward England becoming a constitutional monarchy. Yet this document did not grant rights to the common people. The barons would gain the most from the new legislation. King John was keen to avoid civil war, and many historians still marvel at the fact that the king put his seal on the document at all. Some claim that the fact that John agreed to the demands demonstrates that he did have some inclination to govern his subjects in a reasonable way. Otherwise, he would never have effectively given his subjects the right to declare war on their king. Other historians feel that John was motivated more by his precarious political position than by a desire to govern fairly. Although the signing of the Magna Carta was a truly historic event, it did not prevent civil war. In the months after the charter was finalized, John tried to evade the provisions that had been made. Violence erupted in the First Barons' War. At first, the barons appealed to Prince Louis of France for help, promising him the English throne. After John died in 1216, the barons turned on Louis and installed John's young son, Henry, as a puppet monarch. The Magna Carta was then reissued by John's regent, William Marshal. The Magna Carta was further revised and reissued in 1217 and 1225. Today, most of the Magna Carta is incomprehensible to most modern readers, as it is written in Latin, made up of medieval legal jargon, and concerned with the minutiae of the feudal system and relations between the most powerful barons and the king. Yet, the Magna Carta has remained central to English political life and still serves as a touchstone of English liberties. Amongst its main enduring points was that no one, even the king, was above the law. Everyone had the right to a fair trial, and there were limitations on taxation without representation. These points were initially only intended to benefit the barons, not the general populace. However, over time, the principles were expanded and extended to include everyone, becoming the foundation for English law. It wasn't only the English that used the Magna Carta as a basis for future laws. In America, the Founding Fathers took inspiration from this pact that leveled the playing field of power. For the 18th century politicians striving to establish a new nation, the Magna Carta symbolized the rights of man and liberty against oppressive or unjust governance. The contents of the actual medieval document were irrelevant compared to what it stood for: the idea of protecting individual liberties. To politicians such as Benjamin Franklin and Thomas Jefferson, the Magna Carta represented a desire for liberty and the idea that the people of a nation should be protected rather than oppressed and exploited. In 1774, the First Continental Congress met to draft a Declaration of Rights and Grievances against the English king, King George III. In this document, they made reference to the Magna Carta, including the assertion of rights to liberty and property that were assured by the principles of the English Constitution, which many take to mean the Magna Carta. Another mention of the Magna Carta comes on the title page of the 1774 Journal of the Proceedings of the Continental Congress, where there is an image of 12 arms grasping a column on the base of which is written Magna Carta. Of course, much of the 13th century English document would have been irrelevant to 18th century Americans. Yet the core clauses resonate with what the early American politicians were trying to convey. The relevant main points were the protection of liberties and certain rights, like the right to a fair trial by jury, protection against excessive fines and punishments, the safeguarding of property, and the idea of no taxation without representation. Of the 63 clauses in the Magna Carta, the two that really stood out to the Founding Fathers were clauses 39 and 40. Clause 39 reads that no free man shall be seized or imprisoned, or stripped of his rights or possessions, or outlawed or exiled, or deprived of his standing in another way, nor will we proceed with force against him, or send others to do so, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Clause 40 states, to no one will we sell or to one deny or delay right or justice. Clause 39 is cited as the inspiration behind the idea that the government cannot deprive any individual of life, liberty, or property without just cause, and that legal action can only be taken against someone with the lawful judgment of his equals, which would evolve into the right to trial by a jury of peers. In addition, the phrase by the law of the land was used in all American documents until 1789, when James Madison introduced due process of law in its stead. Madison also referred to the Magna Carta's 40th clause, writing, Justice is the end of government. It is the end of civil society. It has ever been and ever will be pursued until it be obtained, or until liberty be lost in the pursuit. Many historians argue that the idea of protection against taxation without representation comes from Clause 12 of the Magna Carta, although admittedly in a much more subtle way. Clause 12 states, "No scutage nor aid shall be imposed on our kingdom, unless by common counsel of our kingdom, except for ransoming one person, for making our eldest son a knight, and for once marrying our eldest daughter. And for these there shall not be levied more than a reasonable aid. In like manner it shall be done concerning aids from the city of London." At the time this was written, the English barons were objecting to taxes levied on them by the king to fund wars. Although the common people would have been indirectly affected, these weren't necessarily increased taxes for the general populace, despite what the stories of Robin Hood might imply. This clause also doesn't mention elected representation of the people, simply because this concept didn't exist at the time. However, the Founding Fathers were more inspired by the spirit of the document than the exact circumstances behind its creation. For them, the British Parliament encapsulated everything the 13th century barons were objecting against, and the fact that the barons stood up against their oppressive ruler served as a historical inspiration for them to do the same.
So as you can see there in both those videos, a lot of interesting tidbits. The first one being Runnymede being that location in England right on the Thames, where it really becomes a symbol now of the first time that people were standing up to a king to demand their individual freedoms and their individual rights. And so the concept of Runnymede being a rally point for the English people and really everybody who's freedom loving afterwards. So really important location there, as you can see in the history of the lead up to Magna Carta. The other thing being, you saw some of the really important clauses there that were mentioned that really inspired the U.S. Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and many other constitutions around the world that enshrined those really important individual rights to justice, to property, to life, to liberty, and all those important concepts that really had never been enshrined before, but that the people very much wanted. Another interesting thing there about the actual document itself, you saw that it was auctioned off for $19 million. When you look at the actual document, it's in Latin, as you saw in the video, and it's also done in a way that it's very abbreviated. So it has 3,500 words, but of course could have been much, much longer if they had spelled out every single word, but they were abbreviating almost every word that they could to try to shorten it so that the document could be read in one sitting. So really interesting there. And you can see the boiling point of 1215 and the signing of Magna Carta by King John and his representatives with the barons. You saw what led up to that. It started with 1066, William the Conqueror, and all of the kings after William that were continuing to tighten the screws on the British people and still keep most of their interest towards France and towards mainland Europe, and even towards the Holy Land, Jerusalem. To them, England was just something they could squeeze for more taxes and more property. And the people, you can see hundreds of years later, just were tired of that. They didn't want to deal with that anymore. They wanted their rights back. And they wanted to have excessive taxation, and they wanted representation in terms of that taxation. So you can see this was really a boiling point in 1215 that had been going on for several centuries. So hopefully you found that interesting and that you learned a lot about Magna Carta, what's in it, what preceded it, what it inspired ever since, and what the impact of it is on our society and on our rule of law. And that you'll want to dig in some more as to Magna Carta, what it's all about, even read it online. If you want to read it word by word, there's also a translation into English. Highly recommend you do so. It's really interesting stuff. And again, hopefully you enjoyed tonight's program. Please like this video and subscribe to the channel. We have a lot of great content coming your way, and we look forward to seeing you next time on Traveling Through History. Have a good night.
Traveling through history, the show that uncovers the past mysteries. Washington, Jefferson, Alexander the Great, William the Conqueror, or the independence of the states.